This is a TalkStation original podcast.
This is Christine Brin, and on this week's episode of Salty History, we will be talking with Ben Wunderly from the North Carolina Maritime Museum about the legend of the ship Crissie Wright. Inspired by the quote, "Cold as the night the Crissie Wright came ashore," today we will be discussing the history of Crissie Wright, touching on the story of the shipwreck itself, the following this story has taken on over the last 130 years, and a discussion on when and why stories transition from history to legend. It all starts now on Salty History. Hello, my name is Christine Brin, and I'm an Associate Curator of Education at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort. And today I have with me Ben Wunderly.
Yes, my name is Ben Wunderly. I'm the Education Curator at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort.
I've been with the museum for about 14 years now, and during that time I've had the wonderful opportunity to study the history of the Crystal Coast. It includes tales of shipwrecks with various degrees of historical accuracy when I study them. And Ben, I believe you've been working with not only the museum, but also multiple other sites, including the Pine Knoll Aquarium and Hammocks Beach State Park. And you got to spend a lot of time studying North Carolina's history there as well, correct?
Yeah, I'm coming up on 25 years of working with the department, and I've had the luxury of experiencing many different places along the North Carolina coast and kind of taking it all in.
That's awesome. And I imagine during that time you've heard a lot of different legends and coastal stories.
Oh, yeah. I used to work up in Dare County, and, the history in North Carolina, some of the earliest dates back to the coastal region. So, that's kind of where it all began as far as the things that we learn about. And from there, moved down along the coast and just meeting with people and reading, and there's just so much, really.
Yeah. And I guess one of the things that I've noticed when I've studied early history is the discussion between the difference between history and legend. Because we have so many legends that have their basis in history, but they might be sensationalized or they might be different. And one of the things that I wanted to discuss today was kind of that idea of history turns into legend. And we were going to look at the case study of the Crissie Wright, who is both a very well-documented historical story, but also a local legend that inspired a quote. Am I right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you hear these stories or legends, and maybe you hear them for the first time from, a local resident that was born and raised and, probably older generation, and you might not know what it meant or what it was about, or maybe you learned about it, about a historical event, in school or through reading, and you kind of wonder, well, is there more to the story, or is that the accurate story, or things can tend to kind of snowball and become something that maybe they weren't really.
It's kind of like that game of telephone we all play in school where we're all telling each other a word, and then it gets repeated and corrupted, or a phrase.
It comes out completely different.
And kind of circling back to that quote that I mentioned, Crissie Wright, so you say you hear about it from older generation, and the older generation in Carteret County on cold days are in the habit of saying it's cold as the night the Crissie Wright came ashore.
That's how I heard it.
And that's how
many years ago when I
it.
first moved to the area.
And that's one of those like I said, a case study of historical story, a well-documented event that has also become a local legend. So before we talk about how it became a legend, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Crissie Wright itself?
Yeah, this was a ship that carried goods up and down the coast. It was a three-masted schooner built in 1874 in New Jersey, but it frequented ports up and down the eastern seaboard: Wilmington, Savannah, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York. This particular trip, it was headed from Philadelphia to Savannah with a stop in Baltimore.
This was its final voyage.
Yeah, and the time period that we're looking at, I mean, this was January 1886. It actually left Baltimore on December 31st, 1885.
Okay, so it flipped over the calendar.
Yeah, and it wrecked Just that's that.
We are the graveyard of the Atlantic off the coast of North Carolina.
And for a reason, there's so many shipwrecks, and this is just one that kind of sticks out here in Carteret County, as we've been talking about. How it all went down was this ship was headed south from Baltimore to Savannah, and it experienced some rough weather in the Gulf Stream, and it begins leaking. Not the cause of the wreck, but the
cause of what brings it closer to shore.
Yeah, more than likely, they probably were a little bit worried about,
They're
taking
leaking.
on too much water.
I would be worried about that too, and they were probably worried about their cargo.
Yeah, the cargo was guano, which would have been fertilizer for agricultural purposes.
Or, it could have been used in gunpowder too, from what I understand.
Yeah, and you think at the time period,
probably more fertilizer. So they come into shore because they're starting to leak. They've been out in the Gulf Stream experiencing some rough weather.
Yeah, they make it down south off of Frying Pan Shoals, so south of here.
Wow.
But then the wind kicks up and it comes southwest, a really hard gale. The captain decides to turn around and go back north to Beaufort, to a safe harbor. He was an experienced captain. He was 57 years old. He'd been a captain for a long time and had covered many miles on the water. And he says instead of trying to pass around Frying Pan Shoals, which is off of Cape Fear, to the south of us, he decides to turn around and make a run for Beaufort. And he gets to Beaufort Inlet, but then I think things kind of go bad. Yeah, by 3 miles, he ends up grounded off of Shackleford Banks at midnight. That's January 8th, a Friday night.
And it's noteworthy to say, when we talk about it wrecking, it's not like it sank. It ran aground. It got stuck on a sandbar. So it was still, they were stuck, but they were exposed, and they weren't.
Completely. The winds were howling, according to weather reports, at 62 miles an hour and probably higher gusts. So out of the southwest, they were slammed onto the bar off of Shackleford, probably 100 yards off the beach.
And this is where their story really becomes legendary to a point, because it becomes very dramatic. They end up spending a significant amount of time on that sandbar in this very poor weather.
Yeah, one of the worst cold snaps of the late 1800s. When we hear the quote, as cold as the night that Crissie Wright came ashore, it was cold.
It was literally the coldest night.
And it was windy.
Yeah, generations around. I think you said that there were documentation of there being ice sheets on the Cape Fear.
Yeah, we saw there were temperatures in the area that Saturday, January 9th, 1886. Wilmington, 25 degrees. Charleston, South Carolina, 20 degrees. At Savannah, where the Crissie Wright was headed, it was 27 degrees and snowing.
Snowing in Savannah.
Yeah. And they say it was snowing here. According to the wreck report for the Crissie Wright, they said that the weather was snow. A first-hand account of the sole survivor said there was 3 inches of ice that had formed on the ship while it sat there being pounded by waves.
And then I had read in a couple articles, they said that this weather front that caused this weather that we were seeing here in North Carolina, this cold one, was credited with over 200 shipwrecks ultimately. Crissie Wright probably being one of the most iconic and dramatic of them.
Yeah, I believe it. This little cold snap and this weather system really gripped the eastern half of the country, probably, at least from the Ohio River Valley south to the Gulf of Mexico. In New Orleans, it was 15 degrees. In Mobile, Alabama, it was 11 degrees.
So this dramatic weather event definitely contributed to the story of Crissie Wright becoming a legend, probably, because it was legendary weather.
Yeah,
right there on top of it.
The number of shipwrecks that occurred off of our coast over hundreds of years was like, what made this one so special for Carteret County and why did it stick out there? I think coupled with the fact that there was this horrific storm weather situation and that they were stuck on the ship.
Which we'll circle back to that now because we left off Crissie Wright had run aground midnight, you said, on January 8th.
Yeah.
And that ship ended up being out there for 3 days before anybody could reach it. Am I correct?
Yeah. One sailor reportedly jumped off the ship early that Saturday morning after they grounded to try to swim to shore. He didn't make it. Another one was swept overboard by the waves that were breaking over the vessel. He didn't make it. On Sunday, a sailor went overboard because they were knocked off by the broken mizzenmast from off the stern there. The captain freezes in the rigging
They lash themselves into the rigging so they don't get washed overboard like the other crew members.
Yeah.
But that's a mixed blessing because they're now exposed to the weather.
Yeah, 3 of them are frozen in the rigging of the ship. A 4th would have, but he was rescued finally that Monday morning on the 11th.
Yeah. So it took them 3 days to get out there. And during that whole time, we have locals on the beach that, because like you said, it was, what'd you say, 100 yards from the shore?
Yeah, you could see it easily.
You could see it. According to the legends and histories I've heard, you can hear the people calling for help from the ship.
Yeah.
And it's so dramatically close and easy to see, but they still could not reach them despite having their best fishermen, locals out there trying to reach.
They say
The weather prevented them.
The first-hand account from the sole survivor says that there was about 50 people gathered on the beach, and they had brought boats from across Shackleford Bank, so they came and approached from the island from the Beaufort side or Sound side, if you will, and carried these boats that they were going to launch into the surf because they couldn't go out Beaufort Inlet. It was too rough. But then they got to the beach and realized it was too rough there.
Yeah.
They had to just sit and wait.
Yeah, and that once again probably contributed to that legendary status of this story because there's so many witnesses. It was so well witnessed and well documented.
Yeah, you could see the ship. You could maybe even hear, both parties could hear each other, and nothing could be done.
Yeah,
they had to sit there and
for 3
wait.
days. And then by the time they got out there Monday, you mentioned there were, of the original 7 crew members that were on the ship, only 4 bodies left on the ship, one of which they were able to resuscitate.
They say that a local steamer, the Nellie B. Day, which had been used in the area and was under Captain Dudley, was able to finally make it out there that Monday when things started to calm down. Wind-wise, it was still cold. There's still reports by January 11th and 12th that in New Bern it was 5 degrees and the Trent River had frozen over. People were ice skating on.
Ice skating on the Trent River.
Yeah.
There is the making of stories.
Yeah, so the steamer, the Nellie B. Day, makes it out there that Monday and is able to pull the 3 bodies out of the rigging and the sole survivor. And then from there, what happened, we don't know.
We know relatively that the bodies were taken back to Beaufort, and according to local history at least, the 3 were buried in the old burying ground, what is called the old burying ground in Beaufort.
Yeah, on Ann Street.
On Ann Street. And I saw stories where later on like one woman described being a child and watching the bodies be carried through Beaufort. Once again, another very dramatic story, and probably enhanced a little bit by a child's memory. I know you went through some newspaper articles and found that whether or not there's actually 3 bodies in the old burying ground, there's some discrepancy as to one of them might have been picked up by a brother-in-law, and a couple of them might have even been put in a different burying ground.
Yeah, it was pretty confusing, and part of what maybe added to this mystery that shrouded this incident was that every so often a newspaper article would come out, and some of the ones that I found was these dates were like 1935. There's a newspaper article on the Crissie Wright. 1952 there were several more articles. 1957 another article. 1960. So every so often someone's deciding to write about this incident, but every time the articles come out, things are different and changing, and
because they're going off of kind of spoken memory,
exactly,
spoken history.
Yeah, so unfortunately for a historian, it makes it difficult.
Yes,
but that's probably when something is turning from an actual
history to legend, kind of
into a story, into a legend, if you will.
But the general accepted history is that at least 3 of the bodies are probably buried at the old burying ground. You can go there today and still see the grave marker that says common grave for the Crissie Wright.
Yeah, there was one article that said that that's where they were taken, to the cemetery on Ann Street. The survivor is believed to be headed north.
Yeah, he went home.
Yeah, he was probably from New York or New Jersey. 2 of the crew members were from Delaware. The captain was from they said Philadelphia. And the captain's body was taken home. Yeah, they say he was from Philadelphia, but maybe that's just where he was based out of. But I think he's actually buried in New Jersey.
Okay.
And they say that his brother came and retrieved his body and took him home. So we know that he's not buried.
So it's maybe 2 or at the most 3 bodies.
Yeah, if they found the 2 that...
Oh, they did say a couple days later the one body washed up on shore.
Yeah, so if they found the 3 that came off of the ship in the incident, then it's possible that at least those 3 men were buried there.
I know that the one woman that gave those childhood memories of this incident, she talked about the dramatics of going to the old burying ground, which at that time was not the old burying ground, it was just the burying ground, and seeing all of the open graves and having so many open at the same time, and how it really resonated with her, which another dramatic part of the story, adding to its legendary aspect.
Yeah. Yeah, that would hit home really for a lot of people. Usually if you go to a burial, it's one person.
Yeah, and to see multiple open graves like that, and then to have it so well witnessed during such an epic weather event, this just all led to it becoming part of the common memory.
It's the night that Crissie Wright came ashore.
Yeah, and gave it a saying. And you said every few years the newspaper would bring it back up and put it back into the common memory by bringing the story back up.
Yeah, which probably perpetuated the whole legend.
And then there's something pretty epic that happened with the legend in the 1940s. We see the old post office get a mural.
Yeah, and even more solidifying the story in as a local legend. People can go into the post office and see this painted mural of the wreck of the Crissie Wright and say, well, what is that? Why is that up there? What happened?
Yeah, because it's a very dramatic mural. We say it's in the old post office. Today it's the town hall.
Yeah.
So if anybody wants to see it, it is still there. It was painted in 1940 by, I am going to slaughter his name, unfortunately. It was painted by a Russian immigrant and American citizen named Simka Simkovich. Mm-hmm. I think I might have actually not slaughtered that too badly.
It depicts the locals of maybe Shackleford, Banks, or Beaufort bringing the bodies off of the shipwreck onto the beach, and maybe the one survivor, and with the stormy conditions, and so it's a pretty striking painting of this shipwreck.
And what's really interesting for me, I guess, as a historian, is 1940. We see that mural go up, and this is definitely it's part of oral history, but it's still history.
Yes.
1971, we see a book published, which is still around today, called The Flaming Ship of Ocracoke and Other Tales of the Outer Banks, where they actually refer to the legend of the Crissie Wright. So somewhere in that 30-year period, we see it become a legend. Now, this might be the author deciding it's a legend, but now it is the legend of the Crissie Wright instead of the history of the Crissie Wright.
Yeah, it looks, probably sounds
a lot more dramatic.
Yeah, exactly. So someone wanting to read the book and read the story, and the legend of the Crissie Wright.
Yes, I know. And I associate legends with being sensationalized or kind of corrupted bits of history, not always the most accurate. But interestingly, anytime you hear the legend of the Crissie Wright, they get a lot of the facts correct. Yeah. The story's dramatic enough on its own. Unfortunately, I think they tend to leave out the weather aspect,
it really was cold.
It really was that cold and that dramatically cold that night. I guess the question I have for you is, when do you think a history story like Crissie Wright becomes a legend?
Yeah, I think when it just becomes so well known by many of the local citizens and people, and you see it perpetuated in paintings and in books, and it's still written about.
So could something be a legend? Is there an age, you think, for a history to become a legend?
Right. Like this happened in 1886. In 1986, 100 years later, did it become a legend?
Yeah.
Or was it earlier?
We were talking about some other maritime stories that were relatively more recent compared to the 1886 one. For example, we were looking at Titanic. That one is fairly accepted as being a legend.
Yeah, legendary story.
Yeah. Maybe. Would that be, is that too recent? Or Pearl Harbor. They're dramatic, they're well witnessed, they're well documented, similar to Crissie Wright, but would they, 82 years ago for Pearl Harbor, are we talking, is that too recent to be a legend, or does that qualify?
Yeah, I think there was so much documentation, maybe.
So I think there's legends around Pearl Harbor, definitely, and there was a lot of legendary aspects to it. Or the blockade runners of the American Civil War. Yeah,
there's probably some tales that were embellished from that time period of the blockade runners and sneaking behind enemy lines, and or even back to World War II with the U-boat attacks off the coast. And you hear of someone say, well, I heard that German sailors came out of the U-boats and went to a movie.
Yes. And they had movie stub tickets in their pockets.
That they made it to Bogue Banks. And
so then the question is, is that a legend? Is that history? Is that too recent? I tend to think that if there's nobody alive that can first-handedly remember it, that's where we start seeing it become more legend than history. But, I mean, I think it's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, there's definitely other events that have occurred that we don't have all the answers to, really. So maybe at that point, if you can't pinpoint everything, then people can either start to make stuff up or embellish it, and then we say, well, is that really what happened? Is that a legend now?
Is that, yeah. And I think so I went online and I think you looked up some of the definitions for legend that Cambridge and Oxford gave, and they were still fairly vague. So it is definitely a debated issue. Actually, interestingly, I found my best explanation for when history becomes legend from the Star Wars franchise. I have to admit, I had to turn to fiction on this one. They had this great quote called "History became legend and legend became myth," discussing kind of the progression over time. And there was, I found somebody, and they had done a lot more studying into the Star Wars universe than I ever did. And they found that it took 30 to 50 years for history to become legend.
Okay, well, that's
so that was
quicker than I might have
so that was the benchmark they gave, which was fairly one generation. So if we look at something like the U-boat attacks, and we're probably about a generation or two removed from the U-boat attacks, we have the legend of how Body Island got its name. It is supposed to be from the U-boat attacks and the victims washing up on the shore, but that may not be as accurate. That's sensationalized, I'm sure, to some extent. And then going back to Crissie Wright, we're significantly further out than 50 years on that one.
Yeah, I think for it to come up in conversation, and every so often when the weather gets terribly cold and terribly windy, and maybe some snow and ice.
Keeping alive.
Yeah, that probably
Now,
helps.
one of the things with Crissie Wright that I do want to correct the history on a little bit. I don't know if you're aware of this, but it became also a belief that Crissie Wright and the tragic events surrounding it and how dramatic it was one of the catalysts for creating the United States Lifesaving Service, which was a service that was put together up and down the East Coast to respond to ships that had wrecked off the coast. And I say I want to correct history because Crissie Wright sank or wrecked in 1886, and the United States Lifesaving Service came into being in 1848.
Yeah, it had been around.
Yes, it just wasn't in this area.
Yeah.
So while it could loosely maybe be contributed to getting them more funding because of how dramatic it was not the catalyst to create the United States Lifesaving Service.
Yeah, it would be 2 years later that the closest one would be established out at Cape Lookout.
I do talk about how the legend of Crissie Wright is interestingly very accurate when so many other legends are sensationalized. Yeah. But in that aspect, Crissie Wright was dramatic, did have a lot of impact, I'm sure, on the area, but it did not create or cause us to bring the life-saving service to the area.
There were many other shipwrecks that had occurred many years before that were the driving force behind that earlier creation of the service.
So do you think Crissie Wright qualifies as a legend?
I think it does at this point. I mean, to hear it from the local people and older generation, and and for just to say this, for them to use that quote,
to keep using that quote,
to keep using it.
Cold as the night Crissie Wright came ashore, and we talked about the contributing factors. Because, like you said, we've had thousands of ships wreck off of our coast. Why this one becoming a legend? And being well witnessed. it being very dramatic, all of 100 yards off of the shore,
Yeah.
and over 50 people sitting on shore watching it.
Yeah, there were worse shipwrecks.
Yeah, there were.
Where many more people, unfortunately, perished.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to say only 6 people died, but only 6 people died when we have ships that were exploding off of our coast.
Yeah.
Then we have the weather, which in itself was something of epic proportions for this area.
Yeah, we don't see those conditions much lately, but there were. It seemed that it came in cycles every so often. You know, there was a cold snap in the 1850s, a cold snap in the 1880s here, and then 1890s, and then again around 1915 to 1920. There was a few years. Things got pretty cold, and because we don't see it like that, we don't see the Roanoke River freeze over.
No,
like it did.
We're not ice skating on the rivers.
We're not ice skating on the rivers. The little screw pile lighthouses, the pilings were broken by ice flows
during the 1880
Yeah, we don't
freeze.
So that's probably part of what's adding to this legend.
The legend of the Crissie Wright, which, like I said, interestingly, is a legend that is accurately perpetuated, despite its supposed connection to the Lifesaving service, which would have been a cool connection, but it is not. I'm curious to see what the public think. So why do you think the story of the ship Crissie Wright has caught the public's attention for so long? And when does history become legend? Is it that 30 to 50 year time period, or is it about the time period, how long ago it happened, or is it more about the contributing factors such as other epic things being well witnessed, or other epic events such as weather going on, or is it a combination of all of that? I'd be interested to hear everyone's answers. You can comment on this podcast or on the museum's social media pages. Once again, Ben and I are here from the North Carolina Maritime Museum, and our website is ncmaritimemuseums.com. Until next time, we wish you fair winds and a following sea.